Hours before the gathering, a discreet message reached Anne's household carrying Camilla's name, but not Charles's authority. It concerned precedence, access, and an object rarely discussed outside royal walls, and its wording suggested the Queen expected Anne to surrender more than a ceremonial position. The message had been prepared with the careful politeness the palace used when it wanted an instruction to sound like a courtesy. There was no accusation. No demand appeared in direct language. Yet beneath every measured sentence was the same unmistakable expectation: Anne was being asked to move aside. Camilla's office wanted her position in an upcoming ceremonial procession altered. The explanation referred to modernized precedents, the dignity of the Queen's role, and the importance of presenting a united royal order. But the procession was only one part of the request. The second concerned Anne's future access to a historic royal jewel, an heirloom connected to senior royal women, military duty, and the late Queen's personal trust. To outsiders, it might have appeared to be another glittering object from a collection too large to count. To Anne, it was nothing of the sort. She had never treated royal jewels as decoration or proof of status. This piece carried the weight of responsibility. It had been worn during moments of service, sacrifice, and national uncertainty. More importantly, it was tied to an understanding Anne believed she had shared with her mother during the final years of her reign. The message did not openly remove the jewel from Anne's reach. That would have been too direct, too easy to challenge. Instead, it proposed that all future ceremonial use be transferred to the Queen's household, where decisions about access would be made under Camilla's authority. Anne would not technically lose the heirloom. She would simply need permission to approach something she believed had already been entrusted to her care. She read the message once without expression. Then she read it again. Her response was not anger. It was a question. Who authorized this? The answer created more danger than the request itself. Charles's name appeared nowhere. There was no note from the king, no confirmation from his private secretary, and no indication that he had personally approved either the change in procession order or the transfer of ceremonial control. To Anne, the omission suggested that Camilla's household was no longer merely interpreting royal authority. It was beginning to exercise it. Advisors urged caution. They warned that a direct refusal could be presented as resistance to the crown. The distinction between disagreeing with Camilla and defying the Queen could easily be blurred once the palace began shaping its version of events. A written reply, however carefully worded, might later become evidence of Anne's supposed disloyalty, so she gave them nothing. No letter was sent, no protest was recorded, no private accusation could be leaked, softened, or turned against her. Anne understood that inside the monarchy, written words could be edited and explanations could be buried. Protocol was different. Protocol happened in front of witnesses. It could be interpreted, but it could not be erased. Her answer would come without a sentence. Anne entered the gathering carrying no letter, no accusation, and no visible anger. But Camilla already knew that the Princess Royal had chosen a far more dangerous way to respond. Inside the monarchy, a bow can appear small enough to dismiss, yet powerful enough to define who holds legitimacy. Anne understood that refusing one would create no official document, leave no spoken insult, and still deliver a verdict every royal watcher would instantly recognize. Royal authority has always depended on more than titles. It survives through gestures, order, distance, and recognition. A lowered head can confirm rank. A pause can show loyalty. And when one of those gestures is deliberately withheld, the silence around it can become louder than any confrontation. That was what made Anne's decision so dangerous. She was not known for carelessness. She had spent a lifetime following ceremony with almost military precision. She understood where to stand, when to move, and whom to acknowledge. No experienced courtier could dismiss her actions as confusion. She knew exactly what was expected. As she approached Charles, Anne slowed. She gave the king the recognition required by his position. There was no hesitation, no sign of resistance, and no suggestion that she was challenging the crown itself. The gesture was controlled and unmistakably correct. Then came Camilla. Anne continued forward. She did not turn her head. She did not lower it. She did not pause long enough to offer even the smallest appearance of deference. Her expression remained unchanged as she moved past the queen, leaving behind a moment so precise that it felt planned long before she entered the room. Camilla understood immediately. For a fraction of a second, the expectation of acknowledgement remained in her posture. Then she recovered, turned toward another guest, and continued the reception as though nothing had happened. Her voice remained steady. Her composure held, but the effort to conceal the insult only confirmed that she had felt it. Around them, palace aides began forming different explanations. Some described the act as an open breach of royal respect. Others insisted that in that exact setting, no formal rule had been broken. The disagreement was useful. It gave the palace room to deny a crisis, but it could not erase the meaning of the sequence. Anne had acknowledged Charles and ignored Camilla. She was separating the king from the queen beside him. She was recognizing the authority of the crown while refusing to validate what she believed Camilla's household had done in its name. For Camilla, the wound reached far beyond one missing bough. She had spent years seeking visible acceptance from those who remembered the family before her elevation. Public respect mattered, because it suggested old resistance had finally ended. Anne's refusal reopened that uncertainty in a single controlled movement. William saw it happen. He also understood the trap. Any attempt to intervene would force him to choose between protecting the king's household and supporting an aunt whose loyalty to the monarchy had never been questioned. So he remained still. Charles did the same. At first, his silence appeared to be shock. Then, it lasted too long. He did not call Anne back. He did not reassure Camilla. He did not correct the record. By the end of the reception, his refusal to act no longer felt like hesitation. It felt deliberate. Camilla left knowing Anne had denied her a gesture of respect. But the deeper humiliation came from Charles, because the king had watched it happen and chosen not to defend her. But Charles had not remained silent, because he failed to understand what happened. He remained silent, because the disputed jewel carried a history he had never fully revealed to Camilla. The confrontation was never only about respect. Hidden behind the missing bow was a jewel connected to the late queen, an unfinished instruction, and a private understanding that placed Anne in direct opposition to Camilla's household and left Charles trapped between marriage and memory. The jewel belonged to the royal collection, but its meaning had never been defined by an inventory number. Queen Elizabeth II had worn it during moments of national duty, when ceremony carried more than glamour and every appearance was meant to communicate endurance, stability, and service. Over time, the piece became closely associated with her personal sense of responsibility. Anne understood that history better than most. During the late Queen's final years, Anne had been permitted to use the heirloom for selected ceremonial occasions. The arrangement was quiet and deeply personal. There had been no grand announcement and no public document declaring who would control it after the Queen's death. That absence now created a dangerous question the palace had delayed answering. Was the jewel a personal inheritance? Was it crown property? Did family tradition determine its use? or did ceremonial custody belong to the household of the new queen? Camilla's advisors believed the answer was obvious. She was queen, and therefore pieces connected to senior royal women should naturally fall under her household's control. Their argument was careful, formal, and supported by rank. To them, allowing Camilla to decide when the jewel appeared was not an act of ambition. It was the natural consequence of her position. Anne saw something very different. She believed her mother had never intended the heirloom to become a prize attached automatically to status. In Anne's mind, the piece belonged to service. It was meant to remain connected to duty, discipline, and the burden carried by those who had earned the late queen's trust. And Anne possessed something Camilla's advisors did not fully understand. There was a private note, supported by the memory of a witnessed conversation, suggesting Queen Elizabeth wanted the jewel protected from rivalry inside the court. The wording was not formal enough to settle ownership, but it was strong enough to challenge anyone who tried to claim the piece without further discussion. Charles knew this. That was why he could not simply support his wife. To place the jewel under Camilla's authority might look like he was erasing his mother's wishes. Yet siding openly with Anne would weaken the queen's position and suggest that Camilla's title had limits inside her own household. His silence had created the crisis. By delaying a decision, he had left a space where competing offices could act as though approval already existed. Camilla believed Anne was resisting her personally. Anne believed Camilla's staff was using rank to rewrite an unfinished promise. Between them stood Charles, carrying the guilt of knowing that clearer leadership might have prevented the entire confrontation. Senior courtiers feared the jewel was only the beginning. If its custody could be challenged, then questions might follow about residences, patronages, private papers, ceremonial privileges, and other possessions never fully settled after the succession. Then Anne received the information that changed everything. Camilla's office had already placed the jewel on a future ceremonial schedule. Once Anne discovered that the jewel had been placed on Camilla's ceremonial schedule, her missing bow was no longer the end of the conflict, it was the first warning. By the following morning, the palace was divided not over what Anne had done, but over what Charles had failed to do. His silence created two competing interpretations. Either the king had abandoned Camilla in public, or he had quietly permitted Anne's challenge. Camilla's staff wanted an answer before the story could grow inside the royal household. Some demanded a formal correction. Others argued that Anne should be privately warned, then brought into a carefully arranged appearance with Camilla to erase any suggestion of division. A photograph, a shared greeting, even a brief exchange could be used to restore the image of unity. Charles refused every option. There would be no reprimand, no public clarification, no statement explaining that the moment had been misunderstood. He insisted the matter remain private, but that decision only made the silence more dangerous. Without a correction, Anne's refusal stood exactly as it had happened. For Camilla, the message was brutal. Her own household had moved quickly to defend her position, yet the king would not force his sister to apologize. The title of queen remained hers, but in that moment, the protection expected to come with it seemed uncertain. Charles was not calm. Behind his restraint was a deeper fear. He knew that confronting Anne could provoke questions about the late queen's wishes, the private note, and the unfinished arrangement surrounding the jewel. A demand for obedience might lead Anne to reveal why she had resisted in the first place. That would turn a missing bow into a public argument over royal inheritance and authority. Anne, meanwhile, rejected every attempt to soften the incident. She would not attend a staged meeting. She would not pose beside Camilla for a photograph designed to suggest reconciliation. To Anne, that would not restore peace. It would validate the very claim she was challenging. The palace divided into factions. One group warned that if Anne could ignore Camilla without consequence, others might begin testing the Queen's authority. Another argued that forcing Anne into submission would expose how fragile that authority had become. William saw the larger danger. This was no longer a quarrel between two women. It concerned the future monarchy. If royal households could claim jewels, privileges, and ceremonial rights before the king had made a decision, the same confusion could follow into the next reign. He approached Charles privately. William did not defend Anne. He did not accuse Camilla. He asked one direct question: who had the power to control royal assets that had never been formally assigned? Charles could no longer avoid the truth. He admitted that no final decision had been made regarding the jewel. Camilla's office had acted before receiving his explicit approval. Yet Charles still refused to correct her publicly. To do so would humiliate the Queen, expose disorder inside the palace, and confirm that her household had acted beyond its authority. So he chose silence again, hoping delay might prevent deeper damage. Instead, it created a new wound. Camilla learned that Charles had discussed the jewel with William before speaking openly with her. What began as a conflict over protocol now felt like exclusion inside her own marriage. Feeling bypassed by both the king and the heir, Camilla decided she would no longer wait for permission, and prepared a move that would force Anne to respond in front of the entire institution. Camilla's answer was not an argument behind closed doors. Her household quietly confirmed that the disputed jewel would appear at an upcoming royal ceremony, turning a private claim into a public fact, and daring Anne to challenge the Queen where the world could see it. The preparations moved forward with remarkable speed. The jewel was added to Camilla's ceremonial selection, security arrangements were adjusted, and advisors began treating its appearance as though the decision had already been settled. Nothing was publicly announced, but inside the palace, the meaning was clear. Camilla was no longer asking for control. She was preparing to exercise it. The strategy was ruthless, because it was simple. Once the Queen wore the piece at a major state occasion, the photographs would create their own history. Future appearances could be defended as established practice. What had begun as a disputed internal claim would suddenly look official, legitimate, and almost impossible to reverse without exposing the conflict behind it. Anne did not learn this through formal channels. An old palace contact, someone who remembered the late Queen's methods and understood the danger of quiet changes, sent word privately. The message was brief, but it confirmed everything Anne had feared. Her advisors urged restraint. Any public challenge, they warned, could be portrayed as jealousy or personal bitterness. Camilla would appear dignified and composed, while Anne could be accused of resisting the authority of the Queen. The palace knew how quickly a dispute over principle could be rewritten as a family grudge. But Anne was not trying to claim the jewel for herself. She wanted to know who had authorized its transfer and under what power. That distinction mattered. Possession could look selfish. Authority exposed the real battle. She requested access to inventories, private correspondence, and ceremonial records from the late Queen's final years. The search uncovered a sealed memorandum that had never been fully acted upon. Its language was careful, but its meaning complicated Camilla's position. The jewel was described as being reserved for ceremonial use linked to a specific form of royal duty, not automatically assigned to the wife of the sovereign. And that role aligned far more closely with Anne's lifetime of service than with Camilla's position as consort. Charles attempted to slow the process. He suggested postponing the final jewelry selection, but by then too many preparations had been made. A sudden change could trigger questions, and questions were exactly what the palace feared. Camilla also understood the cost of retreat. If she stepped back now, Anne's accusation would appear proven, that the Queen's authority existed only when Charles personally defended it. Camilla could not accept that. Not after years of waiting to be recognized as more than the woman beside the king. The confrontation became unavoidable. In private, Camilla demanded that Anne acknowledge not simply her marriage to Charles, but her institutional position as queen. Anne listened without interruption. Then she confirmed that she would attend the ceremony. What she refused to reveal was what she intended to do if Camilla appeared wearing the jewel. As the ceremony approached, every royal household understood that the next encounter would no longer concern a missing bow. It would determine whether Camilla's authority could survive an open test. Before the ceremony could begin, Charles summoned Anne and Camilla into a private room, hoping to contain the crisis. Instead, years of buried resentment surfaced. The late Queen's name entered the argument, and Charles discovered that silence had only delayed the reckoning. No junior staff were allowed inside. Only one senior advisor remained beyond the door, close enough to be called, but far enough away to ensure that whatever was said would remain within the family. Charles wanted control. He wanted the disagreement reduced to procedure, corrected quietly, and buried before the ceremony forced it into public view. He began cautiously. This was not, he insisted, a struggle for power. It was a misunderstanding created by unclear instructions, overlapping households, and traditions that had never been formally updated. But Camilla refused to let him soften the issue. She turned to Anne and demanded something direct, an acknowledgement that the Queen's household held precedence over private arrangements made before the succession. Anne rejected the argument immediately. Rank, she said, could establish order, but it could not rewrite intention. It could not transform an unauthorized request into royal approval. And it could not erase what the late Queen had made clear simply because those instructions had never been announced to the public. Then, Anne produced the sealed memorandum. She placed it before Charles but refused to pass it to Camilla. Until its authenticity and status were formally confirmed, she would not allow it to be treated as another piece of family correspondence that could be interpreted, dismissed, or quietly removed from the discussion. Its language was restrained, but the implication was devastating. The jewel was to remain connected to duty, continuity, and a designated royal responsibility. It was not described as an automatic possession of the next consort. For Camilla, the words struck far deeper than the question of ownership. She accused Anne of using Queen Elizabeth's memory as a permanent barrier, a way of ensuring that no title, ceremony, or public acceptance would ever make her fully part of the family. Anne did not raise her voice. She said the conflict was not about Camilla's past. It was about the dangerous belief that becoming queen granted control over every object, tradition, and private promise connected to the crown. Authority had limits. If those limits disappeared, inheritance would become conquest. Charles could no longer hide behind procedure. He admitted that he had never approved the original request sent to Anne. He had not authorized the transfer of future access, and he had not personally agreed to place the jewel on Camilla's ceremonial schedule. Camilla stared at him in disbelief. Members of her household had acted not on direct instruction, but on what they believed she wanted. Implied authority had replaced permission, and Charles's silence had allowed it to happen. At last, he asked Anne whether the missing bow had been intended to humiliate Camilla. Anne's answer was controlled and final. She had not bowed because she would not publicly validate a private decision the king himself had never made. The truth left Charles with only one remaining choice: protect Camilla's image, defend his mother's unresolved wishes, or make a decision that would permanently redefine power inside the royal family. Charles's final decision was delivered without announcement, apology, or public explanation. Yet when Camilla entered the ceremony without the disputed jewel, and Anne took her place without being corrected, the palace understood exactly what the king's silence had meant from the beginning. The change was made shortly before the event. Camilla's ceremonial selection had already been prepared. But the disputed jewel was quietly removed. No public reason was offered. Inside the palace, staff were told that questions surrounding conservation records and historical documentation required further review. It was a convenient explanation. It protected the monarchy from admitting that the king's wife and sister had come dangerously close to an open confrontation. It also allowed Charles to stop Camilla from wearing the piece without publicly accusing her household of overreaching. Camilla appeared at the ceremony without it. She maintained the composure expected of a queen. There was no visible protest and no sign that the decision had been forced upon her. But those who knew the original arrangements understood the reversal immediately. The jewel's absence had become its own declaration. Anne took her position without being corrected. No private secretary approached her. No apology was demanded. No carefully arranged gesture was introduced to repair the earlier insult. Charles had chosen not to describe her refusal to bow as disloyalty because doing so would have required him to defend a decision he had never authorized. Instead, he ordered a formal review of royal jewels and ceremonial privileges left unresolved after the late Queen's death. Until the records, private instructions, and legal status of the disputed piece could be examined, neither Anne nor Camilla would control it. The jewel was withdrawn from use. Anne accepted the decision without celebration. She had never demanded possession for herself. Her challenge had been against the quiet expansion of authority, not against Camilla wearing something beautiful. By accepting the review, Anne made clear that her protest had been about restraint, responsibility, and the danger of allowing ceremony to create ownership where none had been formally granted. For Camilla, the consequence was more personal. She remained queen. Her rank had not changed, and her public position remained secure. But she now understood that the title could not erase every loyalty formed before her elevation. It could not automatically cancel private promises, inherited duties, or the late Queen's influence over those who had served beside her for decades. Charles privately admitted that his silence had allowed the dispute to deepen. Yet that same silence had stopped him from defending an action he had not approved. He had hesitated because every possible choice carried a cost. In the end, he drew a boundary rather than choosing a victor. The balance inside the palace shifted. Camilla's household became more cautious. Anne's authority on questions of continuity grew stronger. William watched closely, knowing the same uncertainties could one day become his responsibility. And the original moment took on a darker meaning. Anne's missing bow had not simply been an insult. It was a refusal to let polished ceremony disguise what she believed was an unresolved seizure of power. The monarchy survived the confrontation without scandal or public admission. But behind palace doors, Charles's silence had created a boundary Camilla would never again be able to ignore.